Bom dia. Good morning. You all know how this works, right? When we have a cool stage like this with 4 sides, whichever side claps the loudest for the person who comes up, that's probably where they're going to spend most of their time. Just a tip. Now, before we get started, I want to ask you all, because I was not here last year, how many of you were? How many of you were here at the first SingularityU Brazil Summit? Get the hand up, let me see them. All right, be honest, because I know what the actual number was. Okay, welcome back. And all the rest of you, you're here for the first time? Yeah? All right, very warm welcome to you all as well. Because here's the thing, we all have a role in this conversation around creating the future. And the future is, in fact, too important to be left just to the technologists, even just to the futurists, just to the people who already have a stake because they've built these things in Silicon Valley, they've built these things in other innovation hubs around the world. There is a role for each and every one of us. So I'm glad you're here. You've come at the right time. Now, as Peter said, the future is already here. And yet, we know that tomorrow will be radically different from today. And we know that the tomorrow after that one will be even more radically different. So what do? Are we going to always be in the position of being surprised by accelerating change, always be in the position of having to respond, having to catch up? Or is there perhaps a possibility that we can get a little bit ahead of that curve, that we can do a better job of anticipating what the future might hold, and maybe learning to adapt quickly, and to adapt creatively? That's really what I want to spend my time with you all talking about this morning. How we can accelerate that process of adaptation so that when the future arrives, we can be ready. In fact, maybe we can already even be there. One way to think about this is the idea that Peter introduced a moment ago, what he called leapfrogging. Are you familiar with that idea, that concept? Leapfrogging? That's a real question. You can answer it for me. Yeah? Okay, well, if you're not, I want to catch you up. And I'm also going to play a cool frog video because I can. So leapfrogging is this idea that areas that have historically had poorly developed technology or economic bases can move themselves forward rapidly through the adoption of modern systems without having to go through all of the intermediary steps to get there. That they can take a bold leap into the future. And the best time to do that is at a moment where you are presented with a relatively clear view of emerging and powerful technologies to build new solutions, to build new systems at scale, to get ahead of the game. And sometimes, timing is everything. Being lucky enough to live in that moment, as we all do. But maybe timing isn't the only thing. And in fact, as it turns out, not all leaps are good ones. Having the power and the potential to jump rapidly into a new system or possible solution at scale doesn't necessarily imply that that system or that solution is a good one, that it is the right and adaptive solution for the future that we want to create. And as we all know, sometimes bold solutions have a tendency to create new problems. So what are we to do? Well, I've given this a little bit of thought, friends, and I think we actually have something that we can learn from the frog. I love metaphors. This idea of leapfrogging, I've thought about this a little bit, and I wanted to dig into it and to understand, how does the frog go about leaping well? Not only making a powerful jump, but a jump with precision so that it lands in the right place. And it turns out there's something to this. Frogs have evolved a special hinge joint in the pelvis. It's called the iliosacral joint. And without it, leaping frogs would still have the power to make a big leap, but this special joint, this is what allows them to open up and flex their back legs so that they're almost like an arrow or a dart going straight through the air. That is what gives them precision. That is what gives them the ability to land in the right place. But to make the right leap, the leaping frog had to evolve. And I would argue that when we're thinking about what kind of leap we want to make into our exponential future, we may need to do a little bit of evolution ourselves. So that's where I want to start. All of you probably have a sense that technology is driving accelerating change in our world, that is one of the drivers that is creating the range of possible futures that we can inhabit, that we may even be able to choose from. So let's get into that. Let's consider how it is that we came to have an evolving tool set and why it is exactly that technology advances exponentially. So Ray Kurzweil, the other co-founder of Singularity University, made the observation that technology develops in a system that learns by trial and error, what you might call an evolutionary system, where at each stage in the evolutionary process, the strongest and best results, the most adaptive results in a host of experiments are the ones that are carried forward. And those are used to create the next stage, to launch the next stage of experiments. And those experiments will yield even more powerful results with better performance. And then those will be the results that are carried forward to the next stage. And what we see over time is that an evolutionary process exhibits exponential growth. This is what Ray Kurzweil called the law of accelerating returns. And we can see this. We can see this exponential process at work where technology seems to build itself out of itself almost organically in the history of technology and in the future that technology will take us toward. So Kurzweil took some time to plot this graph in one of his books. And what I want you to see here is on one axis, you have population in millions. On the other axis, you have time. And as you're moving across that graph, you see plotted, the scatter plot is technological milestones. Now this is reductive, it leaves a lot of points out. But what I want you to notice is this. As you move toward the extreme upper right quadrant, you start to see those dots, those milestones, are more closely clustered together in time, such that it starts to seem as though as we approach the present, everything is happening almost at once. Whereas it took a very long time in human history and the evolution of technology to evolve writing, or mathematics, or physics. Once we have some of those key building blocks and we can start to combine them in new ways, we were able to build a lot of other things, powerful things, much more quickly through a process that technologists and future forecasters call combinatorial innovation. Basically building new things out of unique combinations of the old. That's key to innovation. It's not always a gigantic breakthrough that comes out of nowhere. It's a novel combination of pre-existing elements. And what I want you to see is that as we've grown population over time, we've been able to develop more complex systems and more advanced technologies and tools to sustain those systems that allow us to support larger populations and also allow us to get more technologies and tools into the hands of more innovators, more people around the world who are going to be making these new combinations with existing technologies to build tomorrow. And that, I think, is a beautiful thing. As technologies democratize, we are growing the community of solvers, getting more tools into the hands of innovators who really understand the challenges that they want to solve. And what this means is as we've advanced to the present day and as we look toward the future, the pace of technological advance, the rate of solution architecture itself is increasing, and it is increasing exponentially. And now, as we look at our present moment, we can see that just in the last 15 years, the price performance of computation has increased by a factor of 10,000. The cost of data storage has dropped over that same time by a factor of 3,000. And we've had an explosion of data captured and stored and made available. All of these are the preconditions for an age of accelerated machine learning and artificial intelligence. And now, as we consider things like AI and machine learning and data and advanced computation, we can see that the components that are available to the innovator today increasingly are digital. And because they're digital, they're easier to share. They're easier for our innovators and our problem solvers to have in abundance. It's not like you have to ship all the pieces to build the new thing. If the new thing is digital, it can exist anywhere and everywhere in our networked world. And what this means, in aggregate, is that today's crazy pace of change is likely the slowest that we're ever going to experience. And that means that it's more important than ever to learn to take the long view. But we're not very good at that. As a species, we evolved to think linearly, to think that tomorrow will be more or less like today, more or less like yesterday and our parents yesterday, and that change will be incremental. But that's no longer the way the world works. We need to learn to think exponentially, to understand what this curve really means. That's going to be hard. Part of the reason it's hard is something that Roy Amara, who's the president of the Institute for the Future, he's now deceased, but he articulated as something that's become known as Amara's Law, which is a really sharp observation about human behavior and the way that we understand technology. Amara's observation was this: we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run, and then we tend to underestimate the effect in the long run. If you're familiar with the Gartner's hype cycle, where we have this inflated expectation, and then we're disappointed with reality, and then later on, it actually turns out to be a really big deal, but a lot of people kind of forgot about it. That's the same idea you see here. I think a lot of times about something like augmented or virtual reality, which Peter mentioned. When I was a child, I remember thinking surely by my 20s, I'd be living in virtual worlds. As it turns out, I did meet my fiance on the internet, but it was not in virtual reality. And I think only now, 20 years after I was imagining those technologies, are we actually getting to the point where AR and VR are proving to be transformative. We're starting to see the applications that really will realize the potential. But it's taken a lot longer than a lot of us expected. But that's because exponential technologies develop very slowly at first and then seem to explode overnight. Consider another example, well known to all of us. This key point of convergence for all sorts of digital technologies, the smartphone. When first unveiled, Steve Jobs said something to the effect of this being the best iPod we'd ever created. Even the team behind the original iPhone didn't have the sense of what it would ultimately become for us. That it would become this totalizing device that not only changed the way that you work, the way that you connect with people, the way that you navigate, the way that you listen to music, but actually might have some role in bending the course of global politics. Because abundance, which Peter talked about a little bit, is a funny thing. We've been living with information and computational abundance arguably for almost 20 years, but we're only really starting to understand the long-term effects. And arguably, this is the exponential trend that we should have been most able to grasp, because we've been living with it for a long time. Many of you are probably familiar with the idea of Moore's Law, first articulated by Gordon Moore of Intel about 50 years ago. The idea that every roughly year and a half, the price performance of computation at a constant dollar roughly doubles. If we look at a historical example here, you can see on one side a Cray 1 supercomputer. Circa 1976, this was the fastest computer that money could buy, the fastest in the world. Would have cost about $33 million in today's US dollars. On the other hand, you have the humble iPhone 5S. Now 5 generations back, I could probably buy one of these on eBay today for about $120 US. And I imagine all of you have a sense of which one of these is the more capable computation device. But I would bet you still underestimate the exponential returns of Moore's law. And you still underestimate by just how much one of these devices exceeds the other in its power. And this is a thing to sit with and to think about. Because now, as is often joked, you hold in your hand or you sit on more computational power than NASA needed in the 1960s collectively to coordinate a moon landing. If you know a young person, or if you are a young person, there's a good chance you know someone who's dropped the collective computing power of NASA in the toilet at a nightclub on a Friday night. I see some of you laughing because you probably are that person. I'm here for you. And it is kind of funny, but we should also ask ourselves, what are we doing with all of this power? Where does it go? What does it mean to have 4 billion people walking around with this supercomputer in their pocket? And for all those supercomputers to be networked, for each of us to have all of the world's information at our fingertips. What kinds of futures can we create? And what kinds of futures do we want to be very careful about creating? I just found an article on archive.org last month that was published last fall, and you probably cannot read the abstract, and that's okay. I'm going to tell you what this says. This is based on research done by some leading AI researchers on an international team, and they say, we propose a method for generating video-realistic animations of real humans under user control. We're starting to hear more and more about the idea of deepfakes, about being able to present video and audio that look completely compelling of things that never actually happened, of a president or political figure saying something they didn't actually say. That's been going on for a couple of years. This is the next wave where effectively these researchers are able to recreate an animation that looks lifelike of any human figure that they can effectively model with enough video data and then manipulate it and have it move. What you're seeing here, you have the actual human on the left controlling his digital avatar that looks almost exactly like him, almost video realistic in a synthesized output. On one hand, this is very cool. On the other hand, it's kind of terrifying and represents a further step into an epistemological crisis where we no longer know or can agree on exactly what is real, on exactly what we've seen. And I would argue that this represents the scary side of abundance, the scary side of having all this power. And I think makes a powerful argument for why we collectively need to treat this power as a great responsibility. And we need to be very careful about the design choices and the connections that we choose to make, the worlds that we choose to build. Because the thing is this wave of advanced computation, it's not just powering AI, it's not just powering your supercomputer in your pocket. Every technology that is leveraging advanced computation and abundant processing power is itself developing exponentially. These are a few of the technologies that you're going to hear about today and tomorrow. These are just a few of the tools in the toolbox that are now developing at least the rate of Moore's law, which would be doubling in power every year and a half. Many are developing much more rapidly than that. And why this matters is that this evolving tool set, these technologies that are constantly increasing in their power and their accessibility, means that we are living in an evolving context. We're living in a world that is always in the process of becoming something new, where we'll be able to leverage intelligence and even creativity beyond the human to design a future and to realize our preferred future. And in this world of accelerating change, the evolution of technology is continually remaking our economy, society, and culture. And in this complex and evolving context, we have the opportunity, and I would say we have the imperative, to see new challenges and new opportunities. And I want to dive into this evolving context a little bit to show how an evolving tool set, an expanding technology, changes everything around it. And the example I want to use for this is the cost of DNA sequencing. Just off the top, have any of you done consumer genomic sequencing, 23andMe, anything like that? Anybody been sequenced? Is it really just me? Okay, I see a few brave hands. I see some hands from other Singularity folks in the room as well. All right, I would love to get all of you back together in 2 years and ask that same question again and see how the number has changed, and then maybe also tell you, if you don't have your hand up, there's a decent chance you're wrong. Maybe it has been sequenced and you just don't know yet. Because here's the thing, when we were first able to do this, it cost almost $3 billion, and it took about a decade and the budget and resources of a nation state to sequence the first full human genome. About 5 years later, at the point when Gordon Moore of Moore's Law had his genome sequenced, we'd taken an awful lot of those zeros off the price, off the cost. And I want to point out here now that if we'd started with the first figure, almost $3 billion, and I told you, hey, we're going to get so good at this that every year we're going to take off $25 million, that would probably sound like pretty good performance. But at that rate, it would have taken 108 years to reach the price point that we got to just 5 years later, because this technology has not developed linearly, it has developed exponentially. And it didn't take long to knock off a couple more zeros to get to the point of the $1,000 genome. And then in 2017, we started to hear for the first time about the $100 genome. As Illumina Systems started shipping technology that was 3 times faster with a machine that cost under $1 million, we could really start to see the possible consumer applications of these things, the goods and services, the transformational changes in health and healthcare that could be wrought with this technology. And now we're at a point where about 28 million people have done consumer genomic testing in the United States. And in 2018, more people underwent that sequencing than had to date combined. So this is something that is expanding, and this is changing our world. Because we're not going to stop the technology at that $100 price point. It's going to continue from there. In fact, last year, a company called Nebula Genomics launched. This was from George Church of Harvard and MIT, a father of genomics research. And Nebula now offers sequencing where you can buy in for $9.95 and then a subscription billed annually at $7 a month. And I think actually just this month, they've expanded this beyond the United States. They're taking this global. And it's an interesting proposition. Not only are they offering very low-cost sequencing, they also are offering to store your information securely on a blockchain and to allow you, the consumer, to actually choose who accesses your data and how and why. So that one, you could potentially monetize your genomic information, and two, you might be able to advance research into areas you care about. And this is an exciting thing. But it also means that we're moving into an era where genetic information will become abundant, where we're going to know more and more about who and how we come together as individuals and as a species. And we know more and more about how to build and design at the molecular level. That's a powerful thing. There are also some cool things they say you can do that you can find out if you have the potential to become a great athlete. At this point, I'm pretty sure the answer is no for me, but I could verify that as well. But we need to be thinking about what it means for these technologies to be getting out of the lab and out into the world, and what we're going to be able to create and to build, and what kind of choices we'll make with this sort of information in abundance, with these tools. Not only gene sequencing, but gene editing, being able to design and redesign. There's a company called Modern Meadow that I like to mention here. They create custom microorganisms designed at the DNA level to be cellular factories. They're creating advanced biological materials. I think this is really cool. It's fascinating stuff. Their first product is a biofabricated alternative to leather. It looks and feels and behaves just like leather, but it's not coming from a cow. In effect, they're decoupling animal product from animal. And that means decoupling the production of an animal product from the effect that it would normally have on the environment to produce this thing. And as you might imagine, we're not limited to leather. This is just the first thing that they're working on. But Modern Meadows' approach represents something that is known as cellular industry, cellular agriculture, being able to create these micro factories to produce and engineer organic compounds and ingredients and proteins. And I would argue that what we're looking at here is a wave of biotechnologies that this is representative of, that are going to leverage abundant genetic information and this ability to engineer at the molecular level to remake some of our biggest and most important sectors, food and healthcare, and will allow us to reimagine the relationship that we have with the environment. And these abilities and this new context, this evolving context, raise some very, very important questions. Will we learn to see nature as a mentor rather than as a source of materials for extraction? And what will we choose when we have the opportunity to make conscious choices about how we evolve as a species and how we act as stewards of other species and new species? Because the technology, again, is not going to stop here. The tool set is evolving. The context is evolving. Our world is changing. And as we're continually upgrading the tool set, it becomes increasingly important that we also upgrade the tool user. We have, in a sense, a very ancient brain operating in a very, very modern world. And I would argue that learning to think exponentially is not the only mindset shift we need to make. There's another. And the idea of mindset comes from a theory from a Stanford learning psychologist named Carol Dweck. And she articulated two mindsets. On one hand, the fixed mindset, characterized by the belief that ability and talents are more or less innate, that we are who we are, and that's who we're going to be. And on the other hand, the growth mindset, characterized by the belief that abilities and talents could be developed over time, that we could become who and what we want and need to be. And she found, first looking at children and then later looking at adults and outcomes over the lifetime, that skill acquisition and complex problem solving and even success in novel environments are all very highly correlated with that growth mindset, with the ability to fall in love with the process of learning and even failing, and the desire to really develop and to grow. And Professor Dweck said that the fixed mindset does not allow people the luxury of becoming. They already have to be. And I think that in an exponential world, in a world of accelerating change, if we remain linear thinkers, trapped in a fixed mindset, we're more or less standing still. We're not going to be able to adapt. We're not going to be able to evolve unless we make some choices about who we want to be and how we want to become those people. Unless we embrace that growth mindset and become very willing to challenge some of our old assumptions and to admit that some of our ideas are wrong, some of our visions of the future are outmoded, and that some of solving tomorrow's problems is going to require us to admit that today's leaders, in many ways, have created those problems. And to do this, I want to encourage all of you to kill the official future. This is an idea borrowed from a management theorist and futurist named Christian Cruz, who wrote an article a few years ago called Killing the Official Future, where he said that every organization, and indeed every individual, is always operating against an idea of what they think the world is going to be like. And very often, we sit with that idea for far too long. and we don't examine it often enough. We don't take it down off the shelf and interrogate it and make sure that it is responsive to new possibilities. And that is not an adaptive behavior. If we're trapped in old ideas of what the world will be, then we are not going to be able to see the potential of a new world, the one that we critically need to create. And first, we have to imagine it. So I want you to kill that official future and instead embrace possible futures. Think about all the things that we might do. In these 2 days together, I want you to entertain possibility, to open your mind to all of the things that we might become. And I believe that this envisioning of possible futures, this embrace of possibility, understanding all of the tools on the table, and also all of the responsibility that comes with wielding those tools, is the first step in working towards an evolving purpose, a sense of a common goal, of a future that we will be proud to inhabit and proud to have created. Because I believe that if we're serious about creating a better tomorrow, we need to start thinking about what we want tomorrow to actually look like. We only have one of these. And I think we have some ideas now about what we don't want this world to become, and also some ideas, perhaps, about what we do want, about what inclusive, sustainable, equitable abundance could be. I think those ideas are very nicely captured in what Singularity University looks at as global grand challenges, and what the UN has articulated as the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And in a widely cited 2017 report by the UN Sustainability and Business Commission, they made the argument that not only is this the right thing to do, but addressing these SDGs, these grand challenges, by 2030 could potentially create 380 million jobs and $12 trillion in new business revenue. I would argue that solving some of the greatest challenges that you see in Brazil and that we see in our world, those are our greatest opportunities. These are the things that really need to be done. And these are potentially and critically, these are the industries of the future, serving these needs, realizing these possibilities, creating that better tomorrow. But that again is going to require a mindset shift to move from seeing these simply as existential risks in other people's problems, and instead seeing these as our opportunity to do and be better. Such that when we see something like this, that there are 1 billion unhoused in our world today, or lacking adequate housing, we see the possibility to build something new and to leverage some of these technologies and this power in the way that two companies, a housing nonprofit called New Story and a construction tech firm called Icon, have demonstrated when, about a year ago, in my hometown of Austin, Texas, they demonstrated the ability to 3D print a home in 24 hours for less than $10,000. Now, obviously, it was missing some pieces that you would want in your house. But I think it's a powerful proof of concept, a powerful argument that this kind of thing can be done if we choose to do it, and if we build the right partnerships. Notice that this was not just done by the construction tech company. They worked in tandem with a housing nonprofit, perhaps an unlikely partner, to build this thing. And then now, they're expanding on this proof of concept, and they're starting to roll out pilot programs, most of which are in Central America, where they are now working with local communities, local crews, and using local materials with the goal of producing houses for less than $4,000 each. That is transformative impact. That is the work of social entrepreneurs. That, I think, is the kind of future that we want to see, that we want to create. A bold future that is actually worth getting behind. That, I think, can be our common purpose. And in these 2 days together, as we're thinking about our common purpose, thinking about the kind of future that we want to create, I want you to be asking yourself, what does that future need from me? What does that future need from each of us? What does that future need from all of us? And as we work towards that, as we work towards answering that question, I want to give you some answers to get started, some ideas to play with in our time together today and tomorrow. I want you to be thinking about some adaptive practices that may help us on our journey to become something new, to become the leaders that that future needs us to be. These are some that I'll suggest, bringing us back to our friend the frog. You have an opportunity in these 2 days together with all the people in this room, all the expertise collected here, all the potential thought partners, as well as all the smart people that we're going to put on stage, to leverage multiple perspectives, to have your assumptions challenged, to get outside your own head and to see the world in a new way. You have the potential and the opportunity to ask new and different questions about the future, to consider what a moral economy could look like, to consider how can we close the gaps between Brazil today and the Brazil of tomorrow that you want. And how can you leverage the strengths that today's Brazil already has to become a world leader that tomorrow's world needs. You also have the opportunity to make connections across all of these topics and across these sessions, to begin to see and think in systems, to understand that it's not one technology that's going to change your industry or change our world. It's going to be the combination of all of them together. And more importantly, it's going to be the question of how we deploy these technologies and build these systems in a human context, which necessarily means a complex context where problem solving is not easy. And then I want you to think about how we can create new and different narratives. How we can let go of some of our old stories about the future and about our world, and how we can start to build more adaptive narratives that are fit for the future that we want to inhabit. And with that, friends, I will say thank you. It has been a pleasure to have this first session with you. Thank you. I appreciate that one in the front row.